Okay, thank you. So just perhaps to begin my presentation, this slide is actually from an informal settlement in Seoul in South Korea. And I think it's a suitable slide on which to start this presentation, because perhaps going back to the previous session, it's certainly aspirational. And I think we have to recognize that the discussion that I'm going to talk to is absolutely aspirational. We, and I'll go on to talk about the groups I work with and my own work a little bit, are conscious that many of the trajectories of change are not towards inclusion, and there is a need to counter that. The rest of the settlement was a little bit like the background picture, but as you see here, the children have illustrated in a very bright and very colourful way the city they aspire to. I took this picture when I was at a meeting of the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, and they were meeting a new mayor of Seoul, recently not so much elected. He was put in response to a political crisis, but he'd taken up office and he was going to try and move forward a more inclusive process. One of the challenges that process faces is that there was a very strong concentration on people living in informal settlements, which were actually a very small part of the city. But there was very little discussion about people who had been included in formal housing, but had formal housing of a very low standard. So much of the discussion I'm going to talk about in the next 40 minutes is actually more to do with informality. But for me, this slide highlights that the problems of inclusion are not just problems of informality, they are also problems of how people are formalised and the costs and the consequences of very poor quality formalisation. So I have to say, I feel a little bit self-conscious about standing up here. I've very much enjoyed the discussions which have taken place in the last 1.25 days. I feel very honoured by the organisers to be asked to make this plenary presentation. I think I've been asked to make it because I have worked very closely with two networks that you have been introduced to through previous presentations. So firstly, Shack Dwellers International, transnational network of federations of the homeless and landless urban poor. So the Malawian presentations that you heard yesterday, Malawians are affiliated to Shack Dwellers International. I've worked with Shack Dwellers since their inception, 1996. And in fact, my association with those federations goes back before that. Let me say a little bit about that just in a couple of minutes. The other group I've worked very closely with are a group that the two presentations yesterday you heard from Indonesia and the Philippines are both aligned to, the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights. In fact, the federation in the Philippines, because it is incredibly skilled politically, allies itself both to Shack Dwellers and to the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights. So they are two broadly aligned models. There are differences between them, but they represent an extraordinary body of experience that I'll go on to talk a little bit about, because those are the groups that I have learned from in sharing, learned from in my work, and those are the conclusions that I'm going to share with you in the next half an hour or so. I think it's worth reflecting on timing, and I feel a little bit disadvantaged in the sense that much of this presentation has been prepared after listening to the presentations yesterday, because I'm conscious that I'm coming after ideas that have been proposed, explored, a little bit reflected on. So I've tried to be responsive to that. There's a disadvantage in that, and I'm sure I am less organised than I would have been if I'd prepared this presentation a few days ago when I had a little bit more time and space. So that's one aspect of timing. I think another aspect of timing I'd like to dwell on, I was highlighted actually, strangely enough, by the news event of last week and Margaret Thatcher's demise. And Margaret Thatcher was famous in the UK for many things. One of the things she was famous of was something called Tina, and she argued there is no alternative. And I want to highlight this because I'm very conscious in the stories and the practices and the conclusions I will share with you is that there are many alternatives. I do not want you to go away from this session thinking that I am proposing a single answer. What I'm trying to do is share with you the consolidated experience of networks of the urban poor, and what had come out of that experience in terms of struggling for inclusion. But there are many experiences, as I'm already conscious of from the comments that you've made. I'm also going to, I think, well, maybe not inevitably, but I just got back from a trip to South Africa and Zambia. And when I was in both South Africa and Zambia, I was working with some of the Malawian sister federations. So I'm going to try and just illustrate some of the points, particularly from the trip to Zambia. And then finally, I should say I am not a planner. I actually didn't choose the title, and I'm ashamed to say I wasn't perhaps careful enough in my preparations to look closely at the title. This is not a planning lecture, and I'm really, really sorry if you're planners. I work closely with academic planners, but that may have influenced me in particular ways. I work very much with professional planners. There's a very strong consciousness in both the networks, ACHR and STI, that planning is important, and some of the professionals have a planning background. And finally, I would say in the times in which I do interface with local government in the Global South, the planning profession is incredibly influential in determining opportunities for inclusion and determining constraints on inclusion. So planning is certainly relevant. I'm going to talk primarily about three themes, and I'm going to conclude on what I see as three critical collective capabilities that groups across groups in cities have to share and have to develop together. Those groups include local government, include organised urban poor, include interested professionals. So I'm going to conclude on these three capabilities. I'm going to bounce off some of the earlier presentations of yesterday in discussing issues around community capacities and skills. And I think in that sense I'm very fortunate in the timing of this presentation, because I'm conscious that you've been introduced already to some of these by David's presentations and by the presentations in the afternoon. I think I should just highlight that the networks that I'm talking about are networks that are based on residential associations and neighbourhood organisations. So the experiences come out of that history. They are much less well representative of the kinds of struggles of the informal sector vendors and recyclers and other livelihood-based organisations. So that's absolutely a constraint on what I'm going to say. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the ways in which these networks have sought to create a pro-poor politics. Because for me, there's very little point in talking about planning unless you talk about politics. Because unless the political dynamics have changed, planning processes will not shift. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time rethinking professionalism and the lessons I've learned about the rethinking of professionals. Because these are alliances in which professionals and organised communities have come together to create a platform for change. And I think unless we table the ways in which we are thinking about professionals and the ways in which professionals are contributing to a process of social change, we will not move forward. So that's what I hope to do. So perhaps just very briefly to highlight some of the key things I want you to remember about community capacities and skills and what we talked about yesterday. So savings-based organising creates critical capacities, creates financial management capacities, and creates community assets, which are used to address immediate needs, but also provide a platform on which an engagement with the city around resource mobilisation can take place. Enumerations create information and mapping about surveys, enumerations, the profiling of informal settlements, and the mapping of services that exist to prepare for planning, critical capacity. We also touched yesterday on the ways in which plans for settlement, informal settlement upgrading, and types of precedents or projects create an aspiration of a different kind from the one we just heard. These are aspirations around the way in which governments may intervene in informal settlements, and I'll come back to that. Exchanges and learning we also talked about, and I'll also come back to that. I think perhaps before I go on to talk about the pro-poor politics, it's important to recognise that the ways in which urban poor organisations create alliances are critical for a progressive politics. And they are just, I think it's worth registering that those alliances take place at three levels within informal settlements. So alliances between savings groups and existing forms of organisations, alliances between informal settlements, and the creation of city networks of the urban poor is a critical component of a pro-poor politics, and alliances with others beyond informal settlements, which goes back to the theme of the ways in which professionals and professional agencies engage with a process of community-driven change. So that's some of the critical things I want you to remember about that first theme. I'm going to talk about 6 lessons. These lessons, in a way, for me, are what I've learned about how the organised urban poor have created pro-poor politics. I'm going to shoot through them on this slide and then going to talk about them in more depth. Firstly, they have sought to challenge clientelism through the aspiration again, of universalism. And that is a very important part of the process. Secondly, they've sought to increase the legitimacy that is offered to the urban poor. So they are no longer excluded, but they are recognised as a critical component of city planning. Thirdly, they've sought to co-produce services and infrastructure. So the joint coming together of the organised urban poor and the state. Fourthly, the role of women and the contribution of women to a process of inclusive planning and inclusive politics. Fifthly, the way in which relations with the city are built and the link perhaps through the city to national governments. I think, to be honest, I would not talk about national governments here. I think I'm going to run out of time. And finally, and I'll come back to this theme right at the end, this whole issue of political capabilities and how they can be strengthened, both individually and collectively. We've actually, for me, spoken very little about the nature of clientelist politics in the last 1.25 days. I would say it's probably the only theme we haven't touched on. But when I go around and I talk to people in informal settlements, the ways in which clientelist relations are established is perhaps the most common form of politics and perhaps one of the most damaging forms of relationships. There is a large literature on clientelism, which I'm happy to talk about individually or collectively, but I'm not going to go into it now. I think what I would highlight is what I have observed as the problems that communities experience with clientelism are many. I just wanted to highlight some. Firstly, clientelist relations produce partial services. It goes back a little bit, I think, to the point that David made a day ago, when he talked about a politician being frustrated about improvements because it meant he couldn't offer them again at the next election. So improvements are partial. The water pump has got to break down, because if it doesn't break down, a new political deal cannot be made. They are almost certainly pacific, because they respond to a context of resource scarcity by trading the resources that exist for votes. If you offer the same thing to everyone, you don't progress your politics. Everyone has access to water, you can't trade water. So they are pacific, they are particular. And they reinforce existing power relationships because they are all about the continued dominance of an existing political elite. Moreover, they reinforce issues of dependency. And I think this is perhaps one of the themes I'll come back to, because I think it's a very important theme to understand. What these processes are trying to do is create a horizontal diffusion of power. What a clientelist politics does is it reinforces a vertical, authoritative power relations on communities. A critical part of a universalist aspiration is to build a citywide network. That does not, of course, instantly produce more resources, but it means that communities in one place understand how the government is offering resources, perhaps to another place or perhaps to themselves, and by having that information, it enables communities to challenge that process. Let me go back almost 20 years, I guess. When I was in Rio de Janeiro, I remember talking in the mid-90s to community organisations. At that point, the municipality in Rio had a programme that would help 10% of the informal settlements. Every single residents' association I talked to expected to be in that 10%. So it's through citywide networks that communities are able to resist the particularity that creates their dependency on politicians who give them a little bit and who prevent an inclusive politics and an inclusive planning process. What both these networks do in their different ways is create city funds Funds are pools of money. The savings component is critical to giving community capacity to manage their part of the pools of money. But the pools of money are important because they embed a principle of universality. They mean that through the joint management of these pools, community organisations with local government decide who will get helped, decide the basis on which they will get helped, and are aware of the deficit that remains to be dealt with. I'm kind of conscious I'm skipping, well, I'm giving you a very summary perspective, but I want to respect the chair, who is, I'm sure, going to be as rigorous with me as he has been to date. Okay, legitimacy. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this theme as well, because I think the ways in which urban poor networks create a legitimacy is also key to a more inclusive politics. Let me just say, there are many, many ways in which the urban poor are dismissed and are marginalised, not just from politics, but from everything. In Manchester, where I live, you have students who come to the university who are instructed about not going to certain places in the city, certain neighbourhoods, because they are seen as too dangerous. In the same way that you have people who live in informal settlements who will explain to me that if they go for a job, they will never give the address of where they live, because that would instantly dismiss them. So the challenge that organised communities face is to be accepted as legitimate, to be accepted as people who are as worthy to be talked to be included as other citizens. Now, these networks have a complex process by which they establish their legitimacy. Some of the ways we've already talked about. Issues about how information can create a dialogue that demonstrates communities' capacity and capability to participate in urban politics. Savings and the self-help that comes out of savings-based organising is a critical part of the establishment of legitimacy. Governments and elites, the upper and middle classes, are much more likely to respond positively to a community that says, oh, we can manage our rubbish. We can find ways in which we can access water. They are much more likely to take those communities seriously and to discuss with them. One of the, as I say here, in my experience, talking to the urban poor, they are absolutely aware, I think as the introduction to today highlighted, that it is issues of lack of rights and it is issues of injustice that define their poverty and inequality. They do not see that their problems are because they are poor as such. They see their problems are because they are not fairly treated. But the networks that I've engaged with are very conscious that that can be a dangerous card to play because it is a card that has led in some cases to their marginalisation. Because just as people from informal settlements are not accepted as equal, then there are many representations of the urban poor that say they are more likely to be criminals, they will form an urban mob, they are irresponsible people who have bullied their governments into giving them privileges that are not offered to all. So they are cautious about a rights discourse. And I think there are many reasons why they're cautious, and perhaps we can discuss it. But one of the reasons is this. They are absolutely committed to their own inclusion as legitimate and equal citizens. And they strategize in very clever ways to attain that. Just one of the information and enumeration processes are very positive. But in a sense, one of the illustrations, let me just briefly share with you, came up at a meeting I was at 10 days ago with Kitway's deputy mayor. And the federations shared the profiling of one settlement. And the mayor looked at the sanitation statistics, which were truly appalling, with tens and hundreds of people sharing very poor quality toilets. And he said, no, if that's the condition, we must get rid of the settlement. He was absolutely genuine, this guy. He stayed till 6:15 on a Friday afternoon, forcing his officials to be there because he was so interested in having a good engagement. But his response was very negative. But it was only the ability of the Federation to show that they'd profiled all the informal settlements in Kitwe, and these conditions were everywhere, that contested his idea that he could prevent the process by simply expelling one settlement, that the problems were citywide, and therefore the solution had to be citywide. In the same way that the presentation of information can enhance the legitimacy and demonstrate the importance of thinking above the particular to the universal, so I think these federations have learnt that you can have demonstrations in many different ways. This is the same photo David showed you yesterday. It's a photo of the Indian Federation, and it's a celebration. Municipal officials and politicians were invited here and given a platform. They were given an entirely positive reception about how they could work with communities to rebuild the city. But this kind of presentation, this kind of invitation to participate in a public event is of course a threat as much as it is a promise, because this is a manifestation of mass organisation and people's power. I think the third component of pro-poor politics is a co-productive process. Co-production is used to mean many things. For the federations and networks in SDI and ACHR, it's used to mean a set of solutions to urban poverty that are in part implemented by communities, in part supported by city authorities and financed by city authorities. The effort is, or the co-productive effort, respects the fact that communities can develop solutions that work better for them. Maybe around basic services and infrastructure, maybe around housing, maybe around other things that they need, such as livelihoods and health clinics. But these communities also use co-production to build their mass organisation. They do that because they are conscious that if they set up a set of individual relationships between citizens and the state, they will weaken their future negotiating capacity. So co-production is used to preserve their autonomy as much as it is used to draw down state resources for really good ideas about how to improve basic services. So a toilet block is both a way in which communities who lack sanitation can access sanitation, but it's also a challenge, an organisational challenge for the citizens in that settlement to look after that block and to manage and maintain it. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to talk about this, except to say this is an example from Harare, Davasekwa. This is a community that's building an eco-sanitation block. I think these networks are very clear about the reasons why they centre the process on women. And I think probably many of you know about the ways in which women are disadvantaged in urban contexts and informal settlements, for me not to elaborate here. But let me just highlight a couple of points. I think that the savings process engages women. Women are much more likely to save. They see a logic in saving, which men do not see. But women centering the process of women is also strategic. And it goes back to the Indian Federation, who learned how to create inclusive practices by building processes that worked for women who were living on the pavements, who were Muslim women and a minority in Bombay, in Mumbai, who were also sex workers. So they were multiply disadvantaged. And there is a sense in which if you are going to create an inclusive process, you have to identify disadvantaged people and you have to give them the space to develop strategies that work for them. Because if it works for them, it will almost certainly work for other people. If you have strategies that work for higher income groups, then it is likely that the most disadvantaged will be excluded. So savings is based around daily savings. Rich people cannot be bothered to save daily. It just makes no sense to them. They get paid on a monthly basis, they prefer monthly savings. This is a simple illustration of a principle that underpins these networks. This is a picture from Namibia. This was an interesting discussion I had actually with a savings scheme in Omaruru. And some of you may have heard me say this before, but you know, there's a woman here who encapsulated for me what this process means. And she was asked what it meant to be a member of the Federation. And she said the Federation, in the Shack Dwellers Federation of Namibia, means two things to me. When Namibia became independent, I did not feel independent. But now with my savings scheme, I can go to the town clerk, I can go to the mayor, and he will listen to me. Now I'm powerful enough to address and engage the local authority from a position of strength. But she said it means something else. She said it means before I was isolated. This is a small town, but she was still very isolated in her house. Now she said, I have a sister in every house on the road. And that reflects women's disadvantage within their families as well as within their communities. So through coming together and through forming a set of relationships, these women are able to contest disadvantage at these levels and take on a public role. I think to make universalism real requires a rethinking of the way in which we consider cities. Let me just illustrate that with an example of the discussions I was privileged to be a party to in Kitwe. So Kitwe, city in the Copperbelt in Zambia, has more or less, it's agreed, 70 or 80,000 households who lack sanitation, who live in informal settlements, who only have access to pit latrines. Those pit latrines collapse when it rains quite often, and they're living at relatively high densities, which means, unfortunately for them, there's a very high risk that the pit latrines will contaminate the shallow wells they use for water because the water kiosks are few and far apart. The solution, the city council has no real solution for this, partly because in Zambia, water and sanitation responsibilities are given to utilities. The utilities in this town, responsibility of Nkana Water, have a plan to have 1,500 free latrines. So their solution to the needs of 80,000 households is 1,500 free latrines, which will be individual latrines. Both because they're sceptical about communal sanitation and possibly because in terms of the MDGs, only individual latrines count. What the Federation and the NGO who supports them are trying to do is just create a discourse at the city level. How can we take the resources that have been committed to helping 1,500 families get access to free latrines and think about a strategy that will address the needs of all? So that quite simple question immediately transforms the politics, because it is no longer about the small who will be included. It enables the sharing of ideas and strategies to address the needs of everyone, for this simple and ambiguous need that I think we can all recognise is essential in dense urban settlements. I'm going to come back to this in a couple of minutes after talking about professionalism. This is actually a photo from Blantyre. Sarah may recognise it. This is the antithesis of inclusive planning. This was one of the very few toilets in this settlement. And as you see here, all these agencies are anxious to demonstrate what they've done for sanitation. So there's no vision. These agencies have not asked themselves, how are we going to address the needs of hundreds? They've just said, yeah, we want to be part of this beautiful individual toilet block. There's no learning. And I have to say, for me, there's no accountability. They may put their phone numbers on there, but the issue is not about whether this individual toilet is blocked or not. The issue is about the hundreds who do not have sanitation in this settlement. Okay, maybe 3 or 4 minutes on the role of professionals. So we know the problems. We know the ways in which professionals have dominated urban poor movements and have dominated the ways in which urban strategies to urban poverty have been conceptualized. Their success has not been great. We know that. That's why there are 900 million plus people living in need in urban areas. One of the biggest challenges for professionals is that they are meant to know. And I have to say, at a personal level, one of the reasons why I engaged so strongly with these networks was because I didn't need to know anymore. I could say, guys, I haven't got a clue how you do this. And that to me was a great relief. And one of the problems is that we do not give our young professionals space to experience and to articulate their own sense of not knowing. They are expected to know, and that creates so many problems as they start to engage. But these networks have created strong enough autonomous organisations in at least some cities to challenge those relationships. There are many ways in which they challenge the relationships. I'm actually not going to go into this slide because I'm conscious I'm going to run out of time. But these are, if you're interested, talk to me afterwards. The critical point I'm making is that as you strengthen community-based organisations, and they are strong at the city level, they can renegotiate the relationships they have with professionals. And out of that renegotiation, professionals can add much more value than they did before. They can add value because they have a necessary component. If you go back to the original conceptualisation of Shack Dwellers International and the affiliates that made it up, the National Slum Dwellers Federation in India, who in a sense did much of the groundwork for the relational experiences that form the background of this network, they tried and they failed to go it alone. They recognised that they needed an NGO to support their work, to support their linkages, and indeed in some cases to support their ideas, and to offer them options that they neither saw nor understood themselves. So this is absolutely a partnership, and I think the Federation in Kitwe, when it thinks about how can it use the resources that exist within the community, within the utility, within the local council, are very much aware that they need to work in partnership with their professionals to identify possible strategies to take them past the contradictions that they face. So I've talked about these three themes: community capacities and skills, pro-poor politics, and rethinking professionalism. I just want to spend a few minutes on these critical collective capabilities that for me are going to be essential if we are going to achieve a more inclusive politics and planning process. So when we started yesterday, we saw the vision, the terrible vision that consultants are putting forward about what our cities might look like. And as I said I shared with my table, when I interface with local governments, I would say the single most prevalent urban vision of today is Dubai. It is appalling, but it's Dubai. People want metal-clad buildings, they want glass, they want a vision that excludes any possibility of people who are informal and people who are poor, people who have low incomes, people who are disadvantaged of being included. So there is a need to contest that vision. And there is a need to contest the vision at the city level, not just at the neighbourhood level, because our cities are the processes at which most urban politics takes place. I think in addition to that new vision, which is all about thinking about how resources can be best used to meet the needs of all, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but surely within a short space of time. So if that's the first collective capability, the second one is learning and reflection. I think until we recognise the need to learn collectively and to share lessons collectively, it's very unlikely that we're going to move forward. I think the third one is accountability. And I think that one of the most interesting ways for me is the ways in which this process changes accountability. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going through this. And this is what I just have put together relatively recently about the different relationships of accountability that emerge through this process. So enumerations and surveys, they force local government to be accountable to the urban poor and other interested professionals for the scale of neglect. When groups do co-production and document how much it takes to improve a communal toilet block, how much it takes to install drainage, they spark a whole discussion. If that's how much it costs, why has the local authority paid 5 times more in the recent past? Serious engagement around the costs of urban redevelopment. As organisations participate in the network, so they're held to account for how they put forward that community's case. Why are we prioritised for local funds? Why are they prioritised? Why are you not arguing our case better? As the network functions, they ask community leaders, perhaps, who are weak leaders in their settlement, who are not engaging with their residents, why do you not supporting that process? Why is savings so weak? Why is that community not able to enumerate? So you change that relationship as well. As network leaders engage with their local politicians, they come back, they report back, they're challenged to move beyond the particular into the universal. And politicians create a new dialogue with their organised urban poor and realise the old practices have changed and they fall away. So the ways in which accountabilities are changed are absolutely critical to the ways in which politics changes. Politics plays out differently. Briefly, I think we'll probably come back to this in discussions this afternoon, but the language of informality is imperfect. I think one of the speakers yesterday talked about the absurdly false division between formal and informal. Notwithstanding that, the relationships are amending, they're changing, and informality is almost certain to be a part of it, just as formality is trying to be a part of it. There are some things that are formalizing, and this process seeks to formalize particular kinds of solutions, ways of doing upgrading, ways of land sharing, for example, just as in essence it formalizes accountability, not in terms of laws and regulations, but in terms of ritualized practices. But I think at the level of urban development, we can almost certainly say that progressive solutions are hybrids, are going to be hybrids between formality and informality. Okay, this is really the final slide. This is actually a bunch of slightly skeptical Malawian children. And it struck me that I feel this is where we are at, no? These kids were sitting entirely bored by this community meeting, I think, waiting for something interesting to happen. They did not see the relevance of much of the discussions. So they are skeptical, uninformed and skeptical. But at the same time, of course, they are absolutely full of potential. And that is how I see urban development moving forward. Thank you.